Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Sebastian Paredes, CEO of DBS Bank, Hong Kong Limited.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me today to do an opening speech. I have been tasked to talk about macroeconomics, so one of the topics that we like the most, especially under the current circumstances. 2020 was one of the most turbulent years in history, especially the one that I have experienced. Lockdowns, pandemic, US-China tensions, geopolitical tensions, and a dramatic collapse in economic output. The world experienced a 3.3 GDP drop in 2020. The OECD countries experienced almost 4.8% GDP dropped in 2020, and emerging markets 2.2%. But the only reason why emerging markets dropped 2.2% is because China was the only country in the world of significance that has a GDP growth of 2%, 2.2% specifically. On that backdrop, one of the most dramatic GDP contractions in history, we had the impacts of pandemic. And according to The Economist, the latest write-up, they calculate that about 10 million people died so far due to the pandemic. About 95 million people have been pushed to extreme poverty in 2020. These dramatic circumstances have forced many countries, especially emerging market countries, to push back almost a decade, if not more, of economic recovery and poverty alleviation. One of the most dramatic post-pandemic effects that we will face in the future is going to be how the world addresses the social and economic impact that most of these poor countries will have to face as the economic recovery takes place and the pandemic effects subside. IMF estimates that about 16% of the total SME businesses in the world would have gone insolvent in 2020. And as you know, SMEs are one of the biggest employers across the world in all economies. So the post-pandemic impact of what we have gone through these 12 months and so forth, or 18 months now, are going to be the most challenging impacts, especially for richer countries, on how to address the social effects that the pandemic have caused. On this backdrop, interest rates have collapsed and debt levels have increased to historical highs. The debt to GDP, the global debt to GDP at the end of this year will reach almost 100%. That is historical high. How the world addresses the levels of debt that the world has addressed, and how these amazing debt levels with the social tensions that we will face are the biggest challenges that we will confront in years to come. But there is a silver lining. The amazing speed in which vaccines were found and the incredible speed in which vaccination is taking place gives us an opportunity to be optimistic about the future, optimistic about the recovery, but most importantly, optimistic about alleviating the pains of death that we are currently facing. So the IMF estimates that the world this year will have a GDP growth of about 6%. This is great, but growth and GDP growth are going to be not equal. The level of vaccinations are clearly at very fast speed in some rich countries, OECD countries, but none so in emerging market countries. And that speed of vaccination has a direct correlation on the speed of economic recovery. And as such, I think that we will see a very positive economic recovery. We are beginning to see that in 2021. First quarter of the year showed a V-shaped recovery in most of the countries around the world, and this is very good to be seen. The death levels are beginning to drop due to vaccinations, and we expect this year to have that 6% GDP growth. In the backdrop of these dramatic events, I think that there are silver linings, and the speed of innovation, the speed of digitization, the appearances of new industries, the appearances of new companies within those industries are incredibly fast. In the health industry, education industry, automotive industry, banking, finance, and the rest. That acceleration of innovation have improved substantially the way we operate, our opportunities to have new industries for employment and productivity gains. So I'm very optimistic that on the backdrop of such a difficult environment that we faced, there are some positive things to look for, especially in the areas of innovation, the areas of digitization and productivity gains. That is why I do believe that the inflation expectations that currently we are facing are going to be most probably short-lived, because these productivity gains that innovation will bring are probably offset the inflation pressures that we are currently facing. I'm optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic that countries around the world will address the issues of social imbalances and the post-pandemic effects, but also very positive that innovation, digitization will add to the world a very, very important silver lining and opportunities for growth. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sebastian. Next up, we have Mr. Duncan Wong, founder and CEO of CryptoBlock Limited.
Good morning, everyone. Today, my task is to talk about decentralization. This is what I was told to do. And I bring in several points that I would like to share with you. The first one is that COVID-19 and blockchain seems to be two irrelevant topics. But if you just think about during this COVID-19 or pandemic period, we spend actually most of our time in front of computers. And then we do our investment online, we trade online, we shop online. Maybe some of you may date online as well. But the key point over here is that we are doing a lot of things kind of like 24/7. But if you think about the financial services industry, a lot of things, no offense, but just talk about the stock exchange. The stock exchange does not open 24/7, but we would like to do that 24/7. We hop around different stock exchanges. We sacrifice our sleep. But actually, we feel much excited during this pandemic period, hiding at our home from contracting COVID-19, while we are spending most of the time doing this kind of trading 24/7. But still, if you think about DeFi, decentralized finance, it's something that we can do 24/7. It actually matches our living style nowadays. And also in terms of investment, we are actually expecting not just a few percent or 20, 30. We are talking about 50%, 60%, or sometimes 100 or even more percentage of investment return. And also one more thing is that because of this DeFi, thanks to blockchain, we can actually do that really 24/7. And actually, we don't need to worry about the trust, because things can be executed using smart contract. So the point I would like to give or deliver today is that at the financial services industry, we are already embracing this kind of decentralization technology. And also, what I'm thinking or predicting in the future, so-called post-pandemic era, is that this kind of decentralization is going to get everywhere. And you just cannot stop it. And we believe that this kind of smart contract and also the collection of technology that blockchain is bringing to us is going to change the way that we do business and also we live forever. So this is the key takeaway I would like to deliver to everybody over here, and hope that you are going to enjoy this summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan. And last but not least, we have Mr. Chandran Nair, founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Asking someone with an Indian gene to speak for 3 minutes is extremely cruel, but I'm going to try. Okay, so, we talk about the pandemic and everyone says everything's going to change, but I suspect most of us just want to go back to how it was before and catch up and do even worse. So I'm going to suggest that a bit of intellectual honesty is probably worth a few minutes. So here are 5 things I want to share with you. Firstly, innovation. For me, true innovation starts with essentially a mindset shift. Has your mind shifted based on what the pandemic has taught us? Have you learned anything? In most of my discussions, I find most people haven't learned anything. They just want to go back. With all due respect to my brother Duncan, he wants to go back and trade for 24 hours. Well, I don't trade, I don't buy anything online, so I'm not part of the problem. And so that's not a problem I want to deal with, right? So, but we want to go back to the same thing. So I would suggest that innovation needs to be driven by purpose. And not purpose in a sort of hocus pocus way, but really about what are we trying to do? Just because we can, should we do it? And just because it makes money, does it make it an innovation? I suggest a lot of innovations are essentially socially destructive. And so we need to rethink. So if you're interested in innovation, first thing you should do is do a stress test on your innovation. If you don't know how to do it, call me. I'll help you out. So that's the first thing. Not all innovations are essentially socially constructive. I would argue most of them are destructive. Second point I'd like to make is science and technology park. We conflate science and technology too easily. Science is very different. The science, if you're interested in science and natural sciences, etc., the science is very clear. The science is telling us that most of our economic models, our business models, are essentially at war with the planet and people. That's the science. I come from a science background and a technology background. The science is very clear. So don't kind of obfuscate and sort of confuse it with technology. But when they do come together, they can be very good, as we've seen with the vaccines. Science, technology coming together, and we get something very good. But guess what? 10% of the world have 95% of the vaccines. So you need public policy. And public policy is key. And on a global level, we don't have public policy. Same old problem. The rich took it all. They don't want to share patents, etc. So just talking about science and technology and innovation is essentially a discussion that's in isolation and rather stupid. We need to figure out what is the science and technology for. But the science is very clear. We human beings and our business models, my friends, are at war with the planet. That's one thing. The third thing I'd like to say is that there's also, because I'm going to be a panel on environment, and it's very fashionable to talk about environment and sustainability. Environmental protection and management is very separate from sustainability. Please don't confuse these two things. Sustainability is a public good. Environmental management is essentially how you don't essentially allow environmental externalities to affect people. But sustainability is a very different thing. I don't have time to go into it. But if you want to know more, you can read my books. I had to get that one in there. Fourth thing is the suggestion that companies essentially do sustainability too is a lie. That doesn't mean companies are bad, but companies don't do sustainability. Sustainability is a much more complex public good, and that's essentially the domain of essentially governments. Companies don't do sustainable good. You can't ask McDonald's to sell less burgers and make it healthy. They might put a lettuce in it, but it's not called sustainability. So really, intellectually, just be honest, understand the difference between environment and sustainability. Public and common good is not the domain of corporations. That must be understood. That's the domain of regulators, etc., quite often usurped by private interests. And then the last point I'd like to make is, when you think of innovation, think about the world we live in. And this part of the world will have 6 billion people in 2050, plus or minus 100 million. 6 billion people aspiring to live with all the latest aspirations we have about ordering things online and all that junk that comes with it, buying things with money you don't have and all of that stuff. It's unsustainable, impossible. Laws of physics. So 6 billion people in Asia aspiring to live like Americans and Europeans is not possible. So go figure out what innovation actually means. If you factor those things, you might come up with innovations that are actually useful. So that's my take. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandran. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to give a big round of applause to welcome Mr. Eugene Shah, Chief Corporate Development Officer of Hong Kong Science and Technology Parks Corporation, to say a few words.
Wow, right. Thank you. So good morning, welcome to Science Park. For those of you who have never been here before, I suggest that after the event, please go and walk around the entire Science Park. You'll be amazed to see the energy or the ecosystem, how it works and all together. So some years ago, I had the pleasure to attend a TEDx talk at Berkeley by a gentleman called Guy Kawasaki. He was one of the first Apple employees working very closely with Steve Jobs. And his topic was talking about innovation, right? So he used a very good example that I want to share with everybody here today. He used the example of the ice industry, right? So he called Ice 1.0. Ice 1.0 was when people had to wait for the lakes to get frozen, and then they go to the lake, they harvest the ice, and then they bring it to different customers, right? So Ice 2.0 is when they figure out, let's build a factory. Let's make our ice in the factory, and then deliver it centrally from the factories, right? Ice 3.0 is the refrigerator. So once the refrigerator was invented, nobody needs a factory anymore, right? So his point was, for every company in Ice 1.0, they never made it to Ice 2.0. For Ice 2.0 companies, they never made the transition to making refrigerators. So there are different types of innovation. The most basic types is really incremental improvement. So for example, Ice 1.0, you might invent a better pick or a bigger sled to harvest or to transport your ice, right? But curve jumping innovation is going from 1.0 to 2.0, 2.0 to 3.0. So it's a big challenge. It requires a lot of creativity, a lot of imagination in terms of how you see the future, how you see you can impact your customer's life in a much better, much more efficient, much more effective manner, right? So today at CI Summit, we've gathered about 300 different companies from all around the world, about 32 different economies. We have 200 leaders from all kinds of industries in Hong Kong gathering today. So in order for us to push forward, right, we, as a collective whole, need to go and challenge our own imagination and creativity, talk to the companies that are presenting today, and see if they have any ideas that they are able to share with you. So the pandemic basically accelerated the adoption of technology by about 8 to 10 years ahead. So you can think of it as Ice 2.0 in the factory with the ice melting today. And we got to accelerate to create the innovation. So thank you for coming today, and I hope you find something useful from the summit. Thank you.